Hello, my name is R.E Brune. Welcome to the Spanish Guitar Workshop. I'm here today with three absolutely adorable heavyweights I'm super excited to tell you about, and I'll introduce them right now. This started out life as an 1883 Antonio de Torres, and I'll explain exactly what I mean by that in a moment. The second instrument is a 1927 Santos-Hernandez, and the third guitar is a 1910 Manuel Ramirez ex Frank Wallace. So this was an instrument that was owned by my dear and dearly missed friend Frank Wallace. He recorded upon it, concertized on it, and it was a guitar that he was very fond of, and for very good reason. Now, all three of these instruments really represent the absolute foundation of the Spanish guitar. I don't think you could find three builders that were more significant to the history of our instrument than these three guys, certainly within Spain, and then from them it traveled out to the rest of the world. But they also represent kind of an older style, obviously, within the Spanish guitar, a smaller instrument, and an instrument literally of a different time. We're going to talk all about that and how they all relate to each other. So this is an instrument that was offered to me by a client of mine and a good friend. He called me up and said he had an opportunity to get this guitar if I was interested, to which I said absolutely. He was acting as an intermediary for the then owner. But when he told me about the instrument, he said, I have this 1883 Torres, but it isn't entirely original, to which I said, okay, well, what's going on? And he sent me an article that was written by R.E Brune. Now, Richard is, one of the great authorities on all things Spanish guitar. He's a scholar, he's a great builder, he's a restorationist. He's someone who's completely informed my career, and to which I'm super grateful. But anytime he has anything to say about a guitar, I definitely want to hear it. And this article was incredibly elucidating, like so many of his articles are. The story about the guitar was, pretty straightforward in the sense that it obviously suffered pretty catastrophic damage, and Santos-Hernandez resurrected it by putting a new top on it and replacing one of the sides, and it, as would be much more common in this kind of work, he replaced the fingerboard as well. The thing about this particular Torres is it isn't the smallest shape that he built. It isn't the biggest shape, although it's getting close. I have never seen one quite like this. The depth is quite narrow, even in my experience with his Cypress guitars. I think I've had maybe a dozen Torres over the years move through my hands, and this one definitely is unique. It's also unique in the sense that it's made out of Cuban mahogany, which is a material that even in Torres's day was quite rare and hard to come by. Brazilian rosewood was hard to come by because of the distance and the problem getting it over to Spain in those days, but Cuban mahogany was basically eradicated, as I understand it anyways, by the Spaniards when they were building their armada, the big, huge warships. And the reason they liked this particular material is it's so hard that cannonballs would just bounce right off the side of the boats. And obviously in that application, you can see why that would make it very desirable, but they did a pretty good job of almost wiping it out. Now, as this relates to other Torres guitars, it is, according to Richard, and certainly in my limited or more limited experience with these instruments, it is not the largest size that he made, but it's getting close to up there. I was checking the dimensions of this instrument against other Torres guitars that I've taken notes on, and also referencing Romanios's great book on Torres, which has a ton of dimensional information of various guitars that he had encountered. And I've never found one that was quite like this one. It's a little bit narrower in the lower bout than others, even though the length is pretty close to, as Richard noted, his larger pattern. Even such, it is still what we would consider a rather small guitar. The scale length on this one is just under 650. It comes in at about a 648. And the sides are, as I noted, kind of on the narrow side, even for the Cypress instruments of Torres that I've seen. Now, the guitar came to us, to me, and the repair to the face that had been done at some point needed to be redone. And that was an interesting challenge for us, us being myself and my restoration partner, Carl Franks, Carl replaced the splint and did an absolutely magnificent job dealing with what was there originally and then putting in a new splint to deal with the problems that the original one was having. But I'll show you, this is kind of an interesting thing. That is what spruce looks like when it's fresh cut. That is what an old top that has had lots of UV exposure looks like. So the trick for us was how to create the splint so that it blends in with the top better, and the way I did that was with a UV light. So I actually created a mask for the entire instrument except for this little itty bitty splint, and then let it rip until the color was as close as I could get it to be. And I'm pretty happy with that. I mean, in dealing with older instruments, there's always problems of, the topography of the top. And in the case of the original repairs, there was a little bit of a roll, we call it, to the edge of the splints. And we left that there as opposed to try and make it better by widening the splint. We, definitely felt there was more than enough material to grab purchase to. And as such, we definitely, I think, did a very good job. I'm really pleased with it. And the guitar is solid and good to go for hopefully for the rest of the owner's time with it and then some. So we're going to move on for now to the 1927 Santos. I'll grab it right now. So this was an instrument that was offered to me by a client of mine, and he asked me if I wanted to represent his Santos. I said, absolutely. And what showed up was actually very different than what I was expecting. And I should note that this guitar came to me before the Torres did. So I had never seen a Santos quite like this. It is a smaller body than the usual plantilla. In fact, every Santos I've seen has been on the larger plantilla. We all know plantilla being the term for shape. And it is a kind of a narrower guitar. And it is an absolute jewel. I mean, it's such a magnificent instrument. But again, very different than what I was expecting. I should also mention that this is a shorter scale. This is a 640 scale length. Which is a bit of a surprise to me as well. Now, the thing about this particular Santos, besides its incredible, state of preservation and its magnificent sound, is when I got the Torres, and I'm looking at the two of them, and I realized something. And I'll see if I can show you here. And doing this very carefully is, and I'll line them up like so. Let's see if you can tell. They are exactly the same shape. The dimensions are the same as well. So, Santos Hernandez, being where he was in time and space and who he was as a builder, it is quite likely he was familiar with a lot of Torres guitars. However, this one matching that one so closely says to me it is highly probable that he was aware of that guitar either before the damage or when it was damaged and brought to him, that he decided he wanted to build an instrument on the same shape and plantilla, and that is this guy, which I think is utterly extraordinary. I think one thing that's cool then when you start to compare the two of them, especially knowing that Santos did not follow Torres's pattern for the face, or at least highly probable that he didn't, is to discuss kind of some of the things that are the same and some of the things that are different about these two instruments. Now, under the hood, that is a 5-fan bracing pattern with no what I call cutoffs. I'm not sure what people like to refer them to otherwise, but the little V braces at the bottom that are so common in Torres guitars and so many other Spanish guitars. I feel like I've seen Torres that didn't have those, but I could be very wrong. Either way, and this was very obvious, as Richard pointed out, to be much closer to a Santos than a Torres in how he treated the braces. And this guitar here has 7 fans, which you can actually see very nicely through the face. So that already is kind of an interesting difference between the two. One that is also, to me, absolutely fascinating is the size of the sound hole. So this is a smaller sound hole than that guitar. And why that is fascinating to me is the question of whether or not the rosette in that guitar is original. And I would say that it is probably the case that that is the Torres rosette. And he Obviously, when he put it in the face, he made the sound hole to fit dimensionally with that particular rosette. It's also interesting as well that the bridges are different. So this is much more like what you would expect out of a Santos-Hernandez for a bridge. And that right there looks much more like the original Torres bridge. So, in terms of forensically trying to decide what's original and what isn't, I certainly would not go lightly and debate with Richard on much of anything when it comes to these instruments, but I think I have to say his assessment of what is original and not on that guitar certainly lines up in what I'm seeing. Now, one of the things also about this guitar, as it relates to the third instrument, to the Manuel Ramirez, is that Santos-Hernandez was, before going out on his own, was the head of the Manuel Ramirez workshop. There were 3 builders in that shop. There was Santos-Hernandez, Domingo Esteso, and Modesto Barraguero. I've read that Manuel Ramirez also built instruments himself. He was taught guitar making by his brother, Jose. I don't know to what degree he was active in the workshop, especially at that point, because that's getting pretty close to the end. I believe he died in 1916. So as I mentioned, this guitar was owned by my dear friend Frank Wallace, and as such, it was an instrument that I got to know very early in my career. I met Frank when I had only been building guitars for like 4 years, so certainly one of the earlier great Spanish instruments I got to study thanks to him. And this was a guitar that he loved very much. Now, as you can see, this is an even smaller body than the Torres or the Santos. And I was looking through my Romaneos book trying to come up with a Torres example that conformed to this particular shape. And the closest one I found so far is FE11, which is about the same length, and the dimensions across the body are ever so slightly different, but certainly within what I would call the realm of variability when building in the Spanish style. Now, for those who don't know, the traditional way of building a Spanish guitar is very freeform. There are no molds. You have your top, and then you glue the top to a shelf on the neck. So the neck block extends into the body. It isn't separate like in the violin world or American guitar world. So you're building upside down. You have slits in the heel that the sides plug into, and you bend your sides, and basically whatever they end up being is kind of what they are. It explains a lot of the variability you see from guitar to guitar in these earlier builders who, they were definitely making a living and they were doing excellent work, but not necessarily informed by, our post-industrial revolution mechanized way of looking at things. So it was much more of a handcraft in those days. Speaking to that, one of the things that's very interesting to me as it relates especially to the Santos is the heel itself. Now, you can see, and I'll put in photos for you to see even closer, there's asymmetry here. You have this side and this side are not exactly the same. This is more angular, this is more rounded. This is not uncommon, and I'll show you the Santos is exactly the same way. Whether or not that is enough to say that Santos built this guitar is, I don't think that's possible. I do think that it's an interesting component of what it means to be a hand maker. So you have a dominant hand, and as you're carving with your chisel, you're working on coming at this way, flip it over, and now everything is opposite. And if you have, as I can attest as a builder, a natural inclination one way or another when you're holding your tools, that becomes very apparent. And it takes a lot of effort, at least in my case, to make something appear to be perfectly symmetric. But I'll show you right now with the Santos what I'm talking about as it relates to this guy. This has almost identical, same kind of thing going on with the heel. The shape this way and how it comes to a point there, as well as this, they're very, very close. And it is certainly enough to make me say that it's possible that Santos built it. Domingo Esteso's guitars also look very similar in that regard. So, as I said, it could be any of those 3 guys. None of them are a bad choice, especially when looking at the actual resultant instrument. And in that case, it's one of the most successful guitars that I've had a chance to study from that time period, and certainly by that maker. I hope you enjoyed this short little discussion about these three really amazing instruments. It's my pleasure to do these videos, and if anyone has any suggestions or questions or anything they would like to see in the future, please do not hesitate to reach out and let me know. I'd be very happy to hear from you. Thank you very much for watching.